Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and to be in a context where these issues of domestic violence and domestic abuse are being taken so seriously. These are official published statistics on changes in violent crime. We've been successful in having an ongoing fall in violent crime. But that bottom red line is of changes in domestic violence. The fall in domestic violence has stopped. We've heard much about the crime drop, how it applies to many forms of crime, indeed many forms of violent crime, but it doesn't apply to domestic violence anymore. That's my starting point. So, despite all the major efforts, of which we have seen very many innovations, very many new practices, we see in the last few years that the fall, which had been ongoing, which was so successful, has come to an end. That's the graph. These are the underlying statistics. This is from what was formerly the British Crime Survey, we now call the Crime Survey for England and Wales, and these are the statistics kite-marked by the ONS from that study. So, the fall has stopped. Domestic violence isn't the same as other forms of violence. We need to do different things in relationship to domestic violence. My work has been focused in particular on statistics and on data. I loved the introduction from BT, which gave us the glorious future of this interconnected data in which we could immediately have access to consistent data which could move from one service provider to the next. It's a dream. I hold it as a dream, but we're not quite yet there. I'm going to provide some of the data which is as far as we've got. Some of this data is from this ESRC funded project which has been looking at the Crime Survey for England and Wales. The Crime Survey for England and Wales is a world-leading survey. Whatever I say about it, it is one of the best in the world to study crime. So, challenges. The challenges in particular are to have consistent definitions all the way through, from survey to police to prosecution and courts. At the moment, we don't have that, and it makes it extremely difficult to provide the linked up data, which is so important in this field, to be able to track the movement of cases from one agency to the next and within the criminal justice system itself. These are challenges. We have a number of different statistical data sets. Police record crime. The recorded crime statistics aren't quite enough, so we've got the new practice of flagging. And then we have a survey which asks the population about the extent of domestic violence. And there are two parts to that, the main part and a specialised part. These are the recorded crime statistics. And the question here is, can you see domestic violence in them? No, you can't. So in our main official statistics on recorded crime, you can't see domestic violence. You can just about see sexual offences, that's predominantly rape and other forms of sexual assault, but you can't see domestic violence. So the practice that the police have been working on, which is superb, is to flag cases which might be domestic violence. It's innovative, lots of work have been put into it, it's a major step forward, but we're not quite yet there. These are your 43 different police forces reporting on the extent to which calls for assistance had a domestic abuse marker as collected together in that HMIC report. you will see enormous variation from less than 1% to more than 12%. Not really very credible. We don't really think that domestic abuse varies in different police force areas by between 1% to more than 12%. The figures on repeat victims are even more varied. You've got these figures of a couple of percent up to nearly 50% of the percentage of calls for assistance with a domestic abuse marker for repeat victims. We know that domestic violence is often a repeat offence, so the ability of the police to identify victims who have previously contacted the police is really important in being able to deliver joined up policing, and really important for the rest of us who want to analyse what's been happening from the moment of reporting all through the rest of the system. The HMIC's verdict on this was gently expressed. In view of the extreme variation in the information provided, it's unlikely that some forces data accurately reflects the number of repeat victims. We're not yet there. We could be. Another round of revision. Instead, my work has been focused particularly on the Crime Survey for England and Wales. This is a survey which has long asked the question about domestic violence. So it is a survey which goes back to the mid-1980s and has always asked a question about the extent of domestic violence. So it's to surveys that we have more often turned for statistical information on the extent and nature of domestic violence. It's a large survey, over 40,000 people. We ask the questions in two ways. One is the main questionnaire, which asks the question face to face. And yes, that's hard. Not many victims of domestic violence or sexual assault want to tell a stranger in their house about these incidents in the last year. So we have an innovative methodology that I was involved in, which is a self-complete methodology. The computer is turned around so that not even the interviewer can see the response. And we get a higher response rate for that. So we have two different ways within the survey. So this is different from police data. It's different because it's a sample of the whole population rather than the people who report it to the police. And we've got different units of measurement. And the units of measurement even vary within the survey. Most domestic abuse is violent crime. Not all of it. Some of it extends or doesn't reach the crime threshold, but a lot of it does. Wounding, serious and other wounding, common assault. Not everybody understands that common assault, which is assault without injury, is a crime. Police understand that, but not always in the general public. And that some threats are also crimes. But curiously, sexual offences are treated not as violence against the person, so they're not included in our statistics using the category of violence against the person as the category of violent crime. So the stats are complicated. If we look at what the survey, Crime Survey for England and Wales, reports officially in the public domain every year, we see official statistics on the extent to which crime, violence against a person, is domestic. And here we have this figure of 17% of violent crime is domestic violence. That's our starting point. That's what's officially published. But we dug inside the survey. We got the data from the data archive and looked in detail about the statistics there. And here we have two different ways of asking the question: the face-to-face and the self-complete. The self-complete has the advantage that more people will disclose violence when it's confidential, but we don't have a long time series, and the survey has been cut back so far for reasons of cost that we no longer have an adequate measure of frequency. This means that we have a measure of the prevalence in the population, but we don't have a measure which maps the standard police measure of crimes. We don't have incidents, in a way that's robust. For that, we have to go back to the face-to-face methodology, which we know underestimates the extent of the violence because it's being asked directly, and not everybody wants to answer that question. We have problems in the surveys just as the police have problems flagging domestic violence. But even worse than that is the difficulty of counting those number of incidents. And it really matters because we know that domestic violence is a repeat crime. And we know it really matters as to how often that is. Within the survey, we've got some technical ways of asking that question. Is it a series? You can ask exact numbers, up to nearly 100. You can look at that raw data, but the published data only counts the number of incidents up to 5. Officially, that's justified on the grounds that cases where there's more than 5 might lead to greater variation year by year. This is the ONS justification. The restrictions, which has been there ever since the survey started, is so that the estimates are not affected by a very small number of respondents who report an extremely high number of incidents and which are highly variable between survey years. Well, we looked at that. 11% of cases have more than 5 incidents. We don't think that's a very small number of victims. We think 11% of victims who are reporting to the survey that they had experienced domestic violence in the last year, who have more than 5 cases, is not very small. So we are counting them in. At this point, we are going beyond those published statistics. So within a concept of violent crime, we're arguing that we should be including sexual offences as violence. We think that rape and sexual assault are violence and should be included, and that we should include those offences which have previously been excluded on the grounds that they are above the cap of 5. When we do that, we've increased the number of violent crimes by 60%. Now, I think most of you in the room think that we need to know that. We'll look to our political leaders about what they want to do with that. But you want the truth, and it's buried deep within the survey that those repeat victims have more repeat incidents than is usually reported in the public domain. And it's not random, that additional victimisation. It's concentrated. So it's not just all victims have a few more. It's specific groups of victims. It's the most vulnerable. So we're suggesting that the number of domestic violence crimes is underestimated. The number of repeat victims, repeat incidents is much higher, and the seriousness of domestic violence is underestimated. I'll take you through those stats. So 17% of domestic violence crimes are serious, against women, are serious wounding or rape. 17% of domestic violence reported as crimes are serious crime. I know within the policing world, the category of serious crime matters for prioritisation of resources. I think too often the softer term domestic abuse is used, which leads to an underestimate of the extent to which domestic violence is a serious, violent crime. We've got questions of gender. I'm often asked, is there violence against men? Of course there's violence against men. There's domestic violence against men as well as against women. But it's asymmetrical. There's more violence against women than there is against men. But the published figures, the ones that are published by ONS, provide data on the way of reporting the gender profile, which is at least asymmetrical of any of the data that you can find in the survey. They have 2/3 against women and 1/3 against men. When you use the figures of the prevalence of the victims from self-complete. But in our findings, where we're looking at the number of incidents within the main questionnaire, we find that 71% of the victims are women and 29% of men. The gender profile is more asymmetrical, that is, more women are victims than men, the more serious the form of violence that we look at. You probably aren't surprised, but these are the statistics, and they're not in the public domain. The ones in the public domain have a less steep gender asymmetry. So, violence with injury, domestic violence against women, that's 43.9%. For men, it's only 18%. That's serious, but you can see the gender profile is more extreme with violence with injury than violent crime without injury. A different way of looking at it. Women who've suffered domestic violence reporting crimes to the Crime Service of England and Wales, 87% of those, 87% of the people who are reporting severe domestic violence are women. If we look at the incidents, which is how police normally think of crimes, not of people, then 91% of crimes which are severe domestic violence are against women, not against men. And when we take our new figure, that is, including incidents more than 5, then 96% of severe domestic violence is against women, the remainder against men. So these as yet unpublished figures show greater gender asymmetry in the more severe forms of domestic violence than the less severe forms. So the messages which are going out to the public in the more routinely published are giving an inappropriate image of men being more victimised than they are. They are part of the victims, but not as much in the more serious forms as we see in this data. I was asked to say something about the wider impact of domestic violence on society. I started this work a decade ago. In some ways, this work is really difficult. Why should we translate violence against people into money? Violence is wrong. It's a moral outrage. It's a crime. It causes harm and suffering. Why translate it into money? The answer is, drives it up the policy agenda. That when we're trying to make really difficult comparisons about whether you're spending money on victims of domestic violence or you're spending money on something else, building a new road, for example, you need to know the value and the impact it has. The methodology then is always comparative. And the methodology is using Treasury, Green Book principles, to engage in the comparability of the value of public investment to stop violence, domestic violence, and comparing that to building new roads, spending money on health, and on other forms of violent crime. The Home Office, since 2000, has been building this methodology on all issues of crime, and in 2004, for the then Women's Unit, which is then part of the Department for Trade and Industry, in conjunction with the Home Office, I did the work costing domestic violence. We costed the cost of public services, that is the use of police and criminal justice, the cost of health services, social services and emergency housing, civil legal services for people to extricate themselves from violent relationships and specialised injunctions like those protection orders, and specialised support services to victims, refugees and advice. The figure that most people are interested in, however, is not the cost of public services, but has long been the cost of lost economic output, and it's the cost of the lost economic output which we measured conservatively as the time taken off work as a result of physical injuries, which attracted most attention. We didn't include the cost of diminished productivity, because it's too hard to measure. We did only the cost of time off work for physical injuries. And finally, because the Treasury insists upon it, we measured the intangible. How much value does the public put on the pain and suffering of injuries? We took it straight from the Department of Transport figures for how much the public would pay to avoid a broken leg in a car accident. We applied it straight over to domestic violence. It's controversial, but we did it. All of those, we added it up. We looked for data, we went to the surveys, we looked at the service providers. That's you and the police force. You have some quite good data on how much you cost. Health services, they've got some data as well, and the public's willingness to pay. We add it up, it's 23 billion in 2004. That's big. During that decade, we reduced the amount of domestic violence. Really successful changes. And so by 2009, when I recalculated these figures, the cost of domestic violence to Britain had dropped to 16 billion. We'd saved lots of money by investment in the reduction of domestic violence. It's a major success, but it stopped. That fall has now stopped. So, my conclusions. We need the data. I couldn't have done that costing work to demonstrate its significance to the world unless I'd had some statistics. We needed the statistics from the surveys, we need the statistics from the police. The next step we need, as you need to know how effective the police are in different experimental methods to engage. You're all engaged in wonderful experiments across your 43 different police forces, but we don't know what the impact is because you all gather the data in different ways. You each flag your data on domestic violence in different ways, as you saw from those flags. So I can't simply say, let's evaluate your experiments by comparing the outcome in your different 43 police forces because you gather the data in a different way. And so we can only do it with ad hoc, tailor-made, really expensive research projects. If only you'd collect the data in the same way, we could have much effective evaluation of all of the experiments that you are all busily engaged in, productively and energetically. I want to be able to evaluate those easily and say which ones work. And at the moment we can't. I want data from the police, from the Crown Prosecution Services, from the surveys, which gather it in all the same way. You need it in the police, you want it as individual crimes, because that's how you think. The NGOs, the big services, they want it in terms of victims, because that's how they think. They treat victims. The Crown Prosecution Service wants it in terms of perpetrators and offenders, because they want to have, that's how they think. We need it in all ways. We need, in the surveys and in your work, we need the sex of the victims and the perpetrators, and we need to have the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, otherwise you'll never know whether it's domestic. We need that data tagged on every single crime, all the way through the system, from top to bottom, and then we could evaluate your experiments far more productively. So, what do we know? We know it's a crime, and it's horrid, and it's dreadful, and it's big. We now know that the success story of the fall in the rate of domestic violence is over. It stopped. That domestic violence is more serious violence than most people think it is from the public statistics. That the gender profile is more asymmetrical in the more serious forms of violence, and that's hidden in the official statistics. The gender profile is more asymmetrical in the more serious violent crime than in the less serious violent crime. Costs the country a lot of money, and the published statistics don't yet properly track domestic violence through the system in order to enable us to evaluate the wonderful experiments that you are all energetically conducting in your innovations in police.